Today I'm going to be running you through the standard Hornby cut and shut, turning 2 of these 3-compartment 4-wheel coaches into one 4-compartment 4-wheel coach. So, what's the plan? Well, we're going to turn 4 of these Hornby 4-wheel stubby coaches into 3 of the regular 4-wheel coaches. In order to do that, we have to plan where we split the coaches. You'll note that where we split them is slightly different on all 4 coaches. So on this first coach here, we have that sort of void between the 2 passenger compartments on the long side of the cut, whereas over here we have that void on the short side of the cut. And what that means is that when we put it all together, you'll see down here we've got on the long half there's a void on the left and the other half is slightly shorter without that void. When you smash it all together, it should mean that you only have one void between the coaches, not multiple or none at all if you cut it wrong. Same thing over here on the left hand side, we've got that void, and on the right hand side it's a shorter half and we don't have the void. How interesting. This middle one is going to use all of those short sections. Now, when I put it together, I realized that the whole thing was a little long using all those sections. So from the one just over here, I have cut off that void so that down below, we are missing one void overall. Now, my original plan was to do all of the chassis like the one below me, but when I did that with the coaches made out of the 2 longer sections each, that looked really short and wrong. So I abandoned that. But on this, absolute mongrel coach made of 4 different 1-compartment pieces, it worked. The length was right. So instead, on these longer coaches, I've scratch built a bit of chassis. I've taken the actual wheel and axle boxes off the old chassis and glued them in place at an appropriate spacing for both of those coaches. The roofs are going to be scratch built because the original roofs have that gutter around them that if you cut the roof in half and glued it together, the gutters wouldn't align, so that doesn't quite work. And I also wanted to customize the amount of roof vents and the spacing, all that sort of stuff. And the glazing is going to remain from the original coaches. I'm just cutting it down into 1 compartment and gluing it in compartment by compartment because some of the spacing changes between the compartments when you glue the coaches back together in a different arrangement. For the first time ever, I've made a fun jig for this. So this is going to be my cutting jig. It fits one of these Tamiya blades in it, and hopefully it should allow me to do a very square cut. So here I am using the new jig to cut these coach bodies in half. You'll see this one I'm cutting on the right side of the compartments. This is going to be a longer half and a shorter half comparative to the other coaches. And just putting it together to satisfy myself. Early progress always feels good. Here you can see that 4-compartment coach, and it looks long with that extra compartment, which is why I cut one out eventually. And here is the other coach. So we had 2 brown coaches, 1 red coach, and 1 track maintenance coach. Now here I am in the process of cutting down the chassis. This is going to be the one that goes with the 4-compartment coach. God, I gotta think of a better way to refer to these. Anyway, cutting the ends off, so getting rid of those buffers so that we can glue on the longer buffer chassis section onto this thing eventually. And putting it all together, you can kind of see why I thought the wheel spacing is too narrow for these longer coaches. So the next issue with the 4-wheel coaches, and I don't have any of them left at this point, I've actually already cut most of it up and painted by the time I'm recording this. Big issue is the size of these things. So they're absolutely massive. If we get one of the new Hornby 4-wheel coaches, which I imagine is a good example of the height of a 4-wheel coach, and we put them buffer to buffer, just look at how massive this thing is. That is a huge discrepancy in height. Also to mention that these guys have chassis that actually sit a little higher than they should. The buffer height's around 15.5 millimeters instead of 14 mil. So I'm going to be redoing the chassis, but at the same time, I'm going to solve some of the height issue with these. First thing I'm going to do is, you can see above the detailing here, there's a lip. Maybe you can't see that. Might be better viewed on this gray part here. There's a lip here. That's where the roof connects in. So I'm just going to cut that off because I'm remaking the roofs anyway as a part of doing this. I'm going to cut down that lip so that we reduce about 1 millimeter of height there. And I'm going to trace over, using this coach, I'm going to trace that face onto the other face, cut off the excess bit on top, make new roofs, make new chassis. It's a bit of a process, but it'll make a much more realistic looking coach by the end of it. So here I am cutting off that bit of edge. Now it's pretty easy to do, just get the knife along the edge because the edge makes its own cutting edge. How funny, who would have thought? Here I am tracing the more accurate coach profile onto a piece of cardstock. I'm going to take that cardstock and cut it out and then compare it to the coach ends that I have now. And first thing I'm going to do, because I don't think the text is going to show up well on this, I use a knife to etch out that outline of the newer roof outline. And then once I've got that edged out, I'm just going to get in there and cut chunks out of it. To cut good circles, just cut a few straight lines that are tangential to the curve you're cutting on, and then you can go in with smaller and smaller cuts and eventually cut down to that tangential circular line. You can see I've done another comparison here and just taking all these little extra bits off. And once I'm done that, I will sand it down with a plastic file just to really get that smooth edge in. And I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good, because we're going to end up with 4 pretty different results, but the purpose isn't to be perfect, it's just to be better than we were before. You can see just how much difference that makes when you compare it to the older roof profile. Now, in order to stick these things together, you need to have a fair bit of structural support. Glue works better on a larger surface area, so I've cut out a large piece of plastic card that fits the base of the carriages, and I'm going to glue up the insides of the carriages and the area where that plastic base will go, and then fit the plastic base over that, and that's going to maximize our glue area so that everything stays together just right. Noting also that piece of plastic card in the base has straight edges, so we should be able to keep these sections straight as they dry. Now that middle coach, the 4 compartment coach, that thing's going to get cut down at some point. Hasn't for these videos. The next thing we have to do is get in there with some modeling putty. Now, I hate this stuff. I've never been able to make it work properly. And in the process of filming this video, I figured out how to make it work. How exciting for me. So what I've done, and I'm sorry, I cut myself off with the camera here. I get it on a knife's edge and I work it very gently into the crack that is between the 2 coach halves. And this stuff, when it sets, it can be harder to sand down the edges, so you don't want to put down a huge amount of it, but you've really got to work it into that crack. Get it nice and deep into any fault so that it can form a smooth, flat, continuous surface once you sand it down. Now, the main thing is you don't want to leave too many massive bumps because you won't be able to sand it down that well without getting rid of the rest of your surface. So what I figured out to do is I got the edge of a bit of wood. The wood doesn't really stick to it that much, so it's good to run over it with. And I use that bit of wood to really ram it into the joint, and then I used the wood to smooth it over as well, because again, it wasn't really sticking to the wood, so I could get off all of that excess putty and really drive it into the gap between the coaches. Now, after this step, the next thing I want to do after sanding down the surface is to prime and paint. Now, I can't do the priming and painting until I've got the interiors done, because I have to prime and paint the interior at the same time as the outside. This is just due to having to get the glazing in and fitting up the roof and all sorts of bits. It's just easier to paint the whole thing in one go and then generate all my other pieces to connect onto it. So I'll take you through the process of making the seats. In order to make the seats, I'm going to use a pretty cheap and easy material. It is a binder folder. Now, again, I'm coming at this after I've done the carnage, but this binder folder has something in it which is called chipboard, which is different to the chipboard you get in kitchen cabinets. It's like a cardboard product that makes up, the backs of notebooks or folders. And it is what I use to make the buildings on my layout. You can see it's the same stuff here and here. Now, the reason why I'm opting to use this stuff instead of plastic or wood is just that it's easier to cut, it's really cheap, and you can use PVA glue on it, which, I know it takes a long time for PVA to set, but it's a fair enough glue. So here is that binder folder that got cut out of the last video. I'm just seeing what the width is between the glazings on that existing roof and glazing piece, noting that the width between the two bits of glazing isn't going to change even if I'm getting rid of that roof, so my compartments that I'm putting on the inside have to fit within that. The first bit I'm marking up is the dividers that go between the carriage compartments, which the seats will glue onto. So I've measured how high those need to be based on the approximate roof height in the coach, and the width is the width between the two glazings, and then I cut that out using a Stanley knife. Now I'm measuring how deep those seats have to be based on the width of the windows on each compartment. I'm then going to make these just as wide as each of the dividers because, again, they have to fit between the glazings just like the dividers do. And I'm cutting that all once I've marked it up. I went with 6 millimeters, I think, as the depth for the seat, and again, that was just based on the window width. Oh, going out of frame, putting PVA on this bit. Just imagine you can see it all. And once those are all made up, I'm gluing them down using super glue because I didn't find that PVA stuck well to plastic, even though it did stick to my cardboard. Now comes everybody's favorite part, which is the spraying with primer. Note that I have sanded down all of that Tamiya putty that I was putting on that joint in the coach before, but I just forgot to film that part. So imagine that I showed you how to sand it down. What I did was I used those wood blocks and some tweezers to form an edge with the sandpaper and really got in there with some moderate grit sandpaper. You start pretty rough and then you go finer with that kind of stuff. Now you've got to pretend to be interested in watching me paint this. So I've used Vallejo paints all throughout. I just really like Vallejo, the consistency of it. It takes a lot of layers to paint properly, but that's what I like about it. It very rarely leaves streaks. I'm not an airbrush man. I could be, but the thought of all that masking makes me gag. Also the thought of buying an airbrush. To be fair, I mean, I spend so much time in this hobby, you'd think I could probably afford to get an airbrush by now. You know, I can absolutely justify it, but I have not done so. I'm painting the insides first in just a cream color, or kind of beige, because Vallejo is from war paints. You'll find that they call beige 10,000 names. Just pick one that works. This first coach has 2 first class compartments, so I'm painting those in blue, and then the other ones get painted in green. Now, the color on the outside, this is a Vallejo light orange, I believe. It doesn't come up right until you're about 3 coats deep, so you just got to be patient with this stuff to get the right finish, but you'll get there eventually. It's really important when painting to get into the sides of the windows, and I like to do that all in one go, where I will turn the coach a bunch of ways and get the brush that's just the right size and get in there window by window. Alright, now for the fun stuff, we're going to make a roof. Now the roof has a few components to it. One of it is this kind of structural blank that I'm making now that goes inside the coach and sort of sits at that ceiling level, so it forms the ceiling. It also forms most of the rigidity of the structure. Then we're going to make these struts, is what I'm calling them. I don't know if that's the right word, even though I am an engineer. I'm probably not a good one. Which will sit across the roof and support the actual roof piece that we use. So I'm using the end of the coach just to mark out what shape these need to be, and then I will cut them the same way, which is very haphazardly with a knife. You can see what I'm talking about when I put them on the ends here and give them a bit of structural support with those little members that come down at 90 degrees to them. put it all back in, and you'll see now that because I've cut them slightly wider than that blank piece below them, they fit onto the walls of the coach and hold it up. There's 5 of them here. It just seemed like the right number to do, and with their width, again, they will they've got that slight overhang on each of these struts so that it holds onto the roof and gives you the right height every time. I've then put another beam between those struts. This will make sure that the whole thing keeps level 180 degrees throughout its whole life. I noticed that the blanking piece at the bottom started to warp a little bit, so that extra support really does help keep it straight. Then the next thing is that I'm going to make the actual roof bit itself. So here I'm showing you how much more pliable this 10 thou plastic card is. Now that's 0.5 millimeter thick for those of us who use real measurements. In order to see how wide I need it to be, I've rolled the ruler over the roof, which should give me a good indication of what that total length of that arc is, and then I've measured the length of the coach. I'm now going to measure out that in this 10 thou plastic card to cut it out and make the roof piece. You might see me change rulers a few times over this video. It's because I use the ruler so much I wore the numbers off it. You'll see I roll the coach back and forward over this section. That's just to check that I've done the measurements right and that we just have a little bit of extra tolerance here. You really don't want to be bending roofs multiple times. It's like a day-long process. So you'll want to get it as close to correct the first time you do it, which means, I'm really just a measure once, cut twice kind of guy, but here I'm a measure twice, cut once dude. Cutting it out, and the next step is the fun part. Before I get to the fun part, I'll just show you that I do in fact have the correct measurement here, so well done me. Now, turn your kettle on. I don't know what Americans would do here, but give it a shot. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to tape this section of roof to this glass jar. Now, the glass jar clearly has a diameter. I don't know if it's the right diameter, but always just make it a little bit more bendy than you really need the plastic, because you can always flatten the plastic out more easily than you can re-bend it. We're going to tape it to this jar, and I'm going to use a piece of paper to shield the plastic from the rest of this tape, because the first run I did this, I found that this postage tape I'm using stuck to the plastic and was really not easy to get off. So I'm going to mask up a bit of plastic but still apply the pressure to it by putting this piece of paper on top of the plastic on that jar and then applying the pressure that way. So if that didn't make any sense, you'll see now what I'm doing. Pulling it really tight. You want to pull from the center outwards, not from one side to the other side, in order to apply the pressure correctly over this. Then we're going to fill that glass jar up with boiling liquid. Now, plastics like to bend when under heat, and if you can heat them up and change that structure inside the plastic over a long enough time, it will plastically deform back to this shape. That's what plastic means. So you can see now this roof is arced, and it's not exactly the same arc as that glass jar, which is why you always want to go for a bit of a harsher jar than what you need. You can see here though, it's a good fit for the coach, and I will now proceed to glue it on. In order to do this, I've cut out some bits of paper to the right size as the top of the coach walls and the top of the coach fronts. The reason I'm doing this is that I want to use the coach itself as the mold to get this roof just right. You don't really want to just blindly glue it onto the support structure underneath, because you don't know how that will look on the coach. You really should be using the coach as the way to get this perfect. So if I put the paper between all of the roof and the coach body itself, that means that they shouldn't glue together, and the paper will be easy enough to remove if it does choose to stick to plastic glue, but these glues are meant to melt plastics together, so it shouldn't stick. Now I'll get that in the right position, right amount of overhang, right angle over the coach, all that sort of stuff. And then we're going to get some elastic bands and stick it down, and I'm just going to leave that for a few hours to set in the right position. Once you get those bands on, you can readjust. Just make sure it's perfect by the time you set it down somewhere. Then it's time for the bands to come off. Not really any drama here, you just take them off and the roof should be in the same shape that you left it.
I am very happy that this all worked on the first time I tried it. So, hooray for me. The next part of this roof is we've got to detail it. So, like the other roofs, we're going to put the rain gutters back on. For the rain gutter, I've got the same 0.5mm plastic card that I had before, and I'm going to cut that into some thin strips that are roughly the same length as the roof. So cutting them really thin, got 2 of them here, and I'm going to glue those on opposite sides of this roof into that rain gutter form. You got to work kind of quick with this, get it down and get it into shape and bend the middle bit just sort of up towards the center of the roof so that it ends up arcing across the whole roof. Once you've got it glued on and the glue is set, you can cut off the ends that protrude over. Now it's time for other roof furniture details. So, the kind of modeling I do isn't exact or precise. I'm looking more to create silhouettes, so shapes of things we recognize, things that we expect, because again, you give yourself more leeway to model things in an artistic style, or perhaps not 100% dead realistically when you go for silhouettes and shapes instead of exact realism. So here I'm creating holes in the roof for the roof vents. Now, I don't have access to roof vent products here where I am, or maybe I do, but they're usually in HO scale because Australians model HO more than 00. And I could 3D print some things, but again, I'm pretty set on not using as many 3D elements as possible. And on this project, I haven't needed to use any, so I was going to stick to that at this point. What I am going to use are 2mm shank nails. So just bullet head nails. I think from a distance these things look like roof vents, especially when they're painted the same color as the roof. You really just can't tell from a distance, and they fill a void on the roof just like your brain is expecting. It's the silhouette of the correct amount of detail. When I turn the coach on the side, you'll see what I mean. Look, those are just roof vents. Who would question it? You'll note that they're just off the center line. It's because I forgot I put that rigidity beam in the center line, dead center, so I couldn't just go through that. The next step is to finish up the handrail on top of the roof. You can see those steps at the end of the coach where a guard might step up to get onto the roof, and this handrail is usually an inclusion on the top of the roof. For that, I'm using staples, which is something I use for a lot of different detail parts. I have unbent and rebent the staple to make it a little bit narrower to fit what we need it to, because the original staple was just a little bit long for a handrail in this kind of place. After that, I'm going to drill the world's smallest hole with the world's smallest drill bit, and I'm going to put the staple in there and then use the staple to measure where I need to drill the next hole. This is always easier than just measuring it before you put the staple in. And once that's in there, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to replicate this on the other side and on a few of the other coaches. The next thing is just to snip the ends off so that the roof will fit flush back on the coach body. And once glued in, that's looking pretty good. The next part we can do is then use some bolt cutters to take off the bottoms of those nails. I wasn't just going to leave those in there forever. And the bits that protrude out the bottom of the ceiling look a little bit like light fittings. Isn't that fun? Multiple kind of details all in one go. It was at this point altogether that I realized that the wheel spacing was a little too narrow for this length of coach, so I was going to have to redo my chassis idea.
So my plans for the chassis have changed since I started making these coaches. You'll see the original chassis, the wheelbase is quite narrow. I took off the step boards that were on here, and the step boards did cover that up, but for the kind of coach I was wanting to replicate, they wouldn't have had the step boards. So when I took it off, I went, doesn't quite look right. Also, the buffer height on these things is really high. If you have the track maintenance coach, it's actually the right buffer height, and I did have one of them. You've probably noticed in the video so far. So I have retained the original method on that. We will see that later in the video, or earlier, depending on when I show it. But I've gone with something else now. Instead, I've chosen to cut off as much as I possibly can from the wheels. So, we've just got the top section of chassis with the wheel, axle frame, all of that attached. And then we're going to glue that up into a custom-made chassis. That chassis is going to be made of C-beam, 4mm tall C-beam plastic card, and 4mm tall regular beam plastic card with some bracing in the middle and something to glue the wheels up onto. Now this time I've already made one, so we can see here there's just the minimal amount of chassis retained so that we can glue the wheels up onto there. Very thin little amount. The difference is tiny or minuscule, but it really does make a difference when you put it up against the coach. And the buffer height is now correct. So the buffer height is now 14mm, which means it's probably going to be too low for some of the stuff I have on the layout. But, I'd rather these be realistic and everything else just be wrong. So
I'll show you now how I made that chassis. So I'm going to measure up the length and the width of the coach, and I'll show you these beams firstly. So we've got that C-section beam, which forms the side of the chassis, and just the regular flat plastic card, which forms the front face where the buffers are. Now these things are 4mm high, which is the, a usual 4mm scale height for a chassis, buffer beam and frame. And I've cut these pieces, put them up against the coach just to check that everything looks right before I continue cutting the next one. As a measure once, cut twice kind of guy, I did screw that up multiple times, so I learned a lesson by the time I came to film this. I'm now cutting the buffer ends, which are, again, the width of the coach. And I am firstly going to glue these buffer ends and sides together as two separate corners, and then glue that together once that's set. It's really just because I want everything to be square and even. I've made a shorter section of flat card behind the buffer beam so I can create an angle to connect these C section beams onto. I know that's kind of difficult to see. Sorry that I got that out of frame on recording. I've got my set square in there so that I can check that this thing is gluing at 90 degrees, and I will leave it while it glues at 90 degrees so that I have two perfectly perpendicular sections. Then I can glue those bits together with a fair bit of confidence, and I'm going to use the markings on the cutting board to figure out if the whole thing is square in total. Now I'm going to cut the section of card that goes in the middle of all of this, which will support our wheel, axles and housings. That is made of 20 thou plastic card, which is the same card I've been using for all of my structural pieces. That's 1mm thick, again in new money measurement. I'm measuring the centers of all these pieces so I can align the centers and make sure that I'm gluing everything correctly. And this is important because the wheels will need to be aligned to the center of the chassis, importantly. So I want to know where that center is at all times in order to glue the wheels onto the right place. Now, next thing I'm going to do is drill some holes for the buffers. So to figure out where those holes are, I'm going to mark that out with a pair of existing buffers and then measure halfway down the height of the buffer beam. Mark that out in pencil, use a knife to get that pilot hole going, and then I'll come in with the drill. I'm going to drill some 2mm holes after the first pilot hole, and that is because I'm installing some custom buffers. So again, like I don't have access to 4mm scale roof furnishings, I don't really have access to 4mm scale buffers. So what I'm doing is using some plastic tube, which is almost 2mm in the center, and drilling that out so that it is 2mm in the center. I'm then going to put some flathead nails through this stuff to create a buffer and the housing for the buffer respectively. So you'll see I'm cutting this at about 3mm by rolling the blade over the tube as I roll it back and forth very precisely over those markings in the board. Then using my flathead nail, you'll see that looks like a buffer and its sleeved housing. Once I put it in the chassis, it will look even more like a buffer in its housing. You just have to adjust that length so that you have the right buffer length. I think this looks pretty smart, and it's worked for me over a few different conversions now. So it's become a standard way to make buffers on my layout. Now, next deal, I'm going to cut these nails down using my trusty bolt cutters. Then I'm going to apply a little bit of glue onto that sleeve around the buffer, and I'm going to put the whole thing into the chassis and set it there. Now, the next stage of this, we've got to free our wheels and their housings from the old bit of chassis. So I'm just going to cut away as much of this thing as I can so that I'm left with just the axle box and that section of floor that we can glue into the other part of our new scratch chassis. So I'm cutting off the molded sections of the frame just to get down to a flat surface we can glue on, and I will also get rid of some of the width of this thing so that it can fit within the new frames. Now, none of this has to be precision modeling. It's all going to be hidden, and it's just used so that we can fit things together. So I'm pretty crudely going along and cutting some width off this without taking any detail out of the axle boxes. And you can see now that it fits inside our new chassis frame, so it is the right width. Before I go gluing anything and making it really inaccessible in here, I'm going to paint the insides of the frames black, just so I don't forget to do that. Now, where do the wheels go? Well, I've measured up on the coach that it should be about 23 millimeters from the buffer beam. That is where that center of the axle should go in order for the right separation of axles, and that is so that the axle aligns between the end of the first compartment and the start of that first void division between compartments. That appeared to be what looked right. I mean, it's not a science, it's just a vibe, really. So I'm gluing that on using some Gorilla Super Glue, which I think is a very good product for this kind of thing. I found that these Hornby chassis can really reject a lot of plastic glues. They seem to have a really glossy finish that doesn't stick well, and no matter how much you sand it back, it's not really going to help. So super glue is the only option here. I have left that to dry. Then I'm going to super glue the bottom of it so that I can stick it onto the coach. Now, I wasn't originally intending to do this, but I found that the next step wasn't working quite as well if I didn't glue it down first. So I've glued it into place and check that it's in the right zone. Now we have to do the couplings. Now, I use KD couplings, so I'm not going to show you how to put a tension lock on. I think tension locks are a blasphemous disgrace to the British train-enjoying public and myself, I guess. So I'm putting on a KD. I was originally going to hold the chassis to the body using the screw of the KD, but I couldn't get the holes to line up the right way, even with any amount of measuring. Again, measure once, cut twice, and you can't cut too many times here. So I had to pull out of that endeavor. I'm making some spaces using some spare bits of plastic from this project so that I can screw the KD on at the right height. The correct height for the KD in this instance is the exact bottom of the buffer beam, which, to be fair, with a center set long shank, tends to be where it needs to be for most British stock if the buffer height is correct at 14.5 millimeters. We'll see me put it up to the gauge in a second just to test that I am correct on that, and I am, because I know I am. So you'd use the gauge to figure out what height to put that KD. Screws are better than anything else. This is the other chassis that I'd made using my original intended method of elongating the section after the buffers. This is going to go on my 4-compartment 4-coach, whatever we want to call it. In order to get that ready, I just had to fill in some of the gaps. So I'd use some plastic card to connect all these bits together in a structurally sound way. Again, all structural bits are made of that 20 thou or 1mm thick plastic card. And I didn't film all of this, so just enjoy me smush some paste in and then have a finished product for you all. I put KDs on this thing as well in the end, super gluing it to the body of the coach and screwing it in at the end. Now that we've gone through all of those bits, we've cut coaches in half, stuck them together, built a roof, built a chassis, screwed in some couplings, we have a coach finally. So this one is the first coach, which is the 2 longer halves of a coach, not the 4 individual small compartments. This one is just a regular coach, it doesn't have anything different about it. This next coach is also one made from 2 halves, and it has a guards compartment at one end with these windows for the driver to see out the back. I think if you know what the rest of my channel is, you'll know why I've built this coach and where it's going. You'll notice the face with the windows is different to how it looked in previous bits of video. I didn't like the way I'd originally cut those windows, so I just cut the whole end off and made a new end and puttied it in, but I wasn't going to show you that because it's not essential to the conversion. And here we have the final coach, which is made of the 4 individual compartments, and I've turned this into a brake coach with full ducats. This is modelled after a Stroudley brake coach, but usually those would be 3rd class coaches, so you'd have 3 compartments plus another blank compartment for the guards. So this is a little unrealistic, but looks the part. Again, I didn't demonstrate how to make the ducat, mainly because I couldn't be bothered, but also because it's not essential to converting the stubby 4-wheel coaches into a longer 4-wheel coach. I'll outro this with some footage of the coaches running, so enjoy, leave any questions or comments in the comment section down below, and I'll be sure to answer them. Thank you so much.